And that is it. The game is over. The streak is over. It's been 2,611 days, 7 long years. But all of that is wiped away as the Mechanics have now won their first game since April 29th of 2017.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. The streak is finally over. Cameron's got on his ceremonial Detroit Mechanics jersey. 81 games, 2,611 days it took for the Detroit Mechanics to finally end their losing streak, but they get a big 11-goal win over the visiting Pittsburgh Thunderbirds in Week 9 as the headline item as we barrel into the final month of the 2024 UFA regular season. But there were a slew of interesting results from around the league as 12 of the 13 home teams came away with a win from last week's slate. The East playoffs are entirely clinched at this point. The ordering is still up for debate as DC, Boston, and New York all punch their playoff tickets in 2024. There's a handful of other teams on the verge of clinching their playoff spots in the East, Central, and West, but nothing quite certain as of yet. Cam, I know you and your Alley Cats experienced a tough loss on the road in Chicago in another wind turmoil game in that lakeside venue in Evanston that the Union have been playing at this year. Chaos season continues to just sort of eat people leg up this year. It doesn't really feel like, again, we have any discernment as to what to expect week to week. We've got a little bit more of a clear playoff picture, but what are your opening thoughts after playing and seeing the results of Week 9?
I mean, first off, you got to talk about Detroit, right? Like, finally snapping the streak. I've been hearing for years from players, from people on the outside who are looking at the team that, like, this is the year the streak ends. Finally happened. And by 11, that was the most shocking part. I actually felt pretty confident, even talking to some teammates before the game, they're like, hey, today's the day Detroit breaks the streak. But when I found out it was by 11, that was the most shocking part of it. That's like 11. It would take Oakland 11 games to post a plus 11. Because they would win each game by one, obviously.
Oakland did get a 3-goal win over San Diego and all but clinched a playoff spot in the West Division. So we do have to give some props to the Spiders. We'll talk about them in a minute. I should also, before you take back over, we should mention Atlanta also getting a very big win by 6 goals at home over the previously undefeated Carolina Flyers. So now there are no more undefeated teams within the slate of UFA competitors. As the first time since 2021 we have not had an undefeated team. Sayonara, New York Empire. But plenty of intrigue throughout the league.
Oh yeah, it was a really interesting week, despite the fact that there weren't like necessarily a ton of marquee games. I still feel like there's a lot I came away with. First off, longest losing streak in the league right now belongs to Dallas. So from Detroit to Dallas, Dallas led at halftime of both of their games this weekend. Actually was punching up with Austin. I think at one point early in the third quarter, I believe they took like a 2-goal lead, and then Austin kind of did, take control of the game later. So it looked like Dallas and Detroit both might get wins this weekend. At one point, Dallas had a 3-goal lead at halftime against Houston before getting outscored by 6 in the second half. Houston continued their dominance over Dallas this season. I believe that is their 4th win against Dallas in as many games this year. I know we're going to get to Atlanta, Carolina. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today talking about, because it was the only really big marquee matchup. I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about Detroit, just because, we don't really talk about Detroit. And when we do, it's in passing of like how many games their streak is, and are they ever going to win a game? And, and then we go back to kind of ignoring them. So I do want to give them a little bit of shine. special shout out to Terry Gaither, who was an Alley Cat, did play, and I want to say 2 or 3 games for us. I've taken the field with him before, and just an amazing guy. Like, he actually, despite the fact that he's played for Detroit for a few seasons now, actually ran some youth clinics in the Indy area for Indianapolis, like for the Alley Cats, basically. So continues to like build up the community here in Indianapolis, despite playing in Detroit. One of the nicest guys you'll ever play against too. And at 37, still incredibly fast and athletic.
I didn't need to know that.
Yeah.
Being a 36-year-old,
Yeah.
I did not need to know Terry Gaither is 37. I should know that. I'm friends with him on LinkedIn. To all your points, fantastic individual, but I was keeping myself in the dark as far as how many people are still playing in this league that are my age or older.
Yeah, I mean, he's still doing it. He's still in great shape. You know, there's some other Indy area guys in that team too. Brad Kinnis was a practice player for us who played in that game. Richie is a Butler player. So he's another Indy guy. Really awesome for them, and to like do it convincingly. Like I think that's the other thing. On the flip side, Pittsburgh, like, come on, it looked like there were parts of that game where, like, in the fourth quarter, it really did look like Pittsburgh, some of the players gave up. I think there was a deep shot. I don't remember who it was to, and it was like early-ish or maybe middle of the fourth quarter. And I think John Mass was running back on defense. He hasn't even jumped to like even try to affect, like, it did look like there was some giving up on Pittsburgh. Like, they had like, they didn't just win the physical battle on the field. They won like the emotional and mental battle. Like, Pittsburgh, there was a shot at one point. Max Shepard is off on the sideline, hands in his head, like head on the ground. Like, what is happening right now? It was a sight to behold, because I think if you would have asked anyone when the streak was going to end and what was it going to look like, you would have assumed it would have looked like, you know, Detroit winning by like a goal or two. But this was, you know, they were pretty much in the driver's seat from the very beginning of the game. And that's something you certainly haven't been able to say during this streak. But kudos to them. Well-deserved. Big shout out to Terry, not just being a great guy, being a friend of mine, but for being the longest current tenured player on that team and having, you know, the most losses under his belt with the Mechanics before breaking that streak. They're going to have a much tougher test with a Minnesota team that has its full lineup, I'm assuming, coming up. But, you know, they've had opportunities in the past to take advantage of teams who brought less than ideal lineups, and they haven't been able to do it. So I know that Pittsburgh basically had their C team out there. I mean, Andrew Gardner was suiting up, for heaven's sake. But still, you have to go out there and actually do it. And they've had opportunities in the past to do that, and they haven't. So the fact that they finally did it and did it convincingly, like, good for them. That took the edge off a little bit, because the first thing after we lose in Chicago, of course, I'm grumpy and not happy. And then I heard that they won by 11, and it actually put a little pep in my step. And the first thing I did was run over to Andrew Sjogren, who, of course, was a Mechanics player for a while, and was like, Shrew, did you hear what happened? And he's like, yeah, I heard they won by 11. I was just like, wanted to go tell him, having been somebody who had been a part of that franchise for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and there was just a lot of celebration, I think, around the Ultimate Frisbee community on Saturday night as Detroit was pulling that off. I don't think I've ever seen quite the live viewership and commentary of Watch UFA TV television like during that Detroit game, where people were talking about we should flex it to game of the week. There was the, you know, just shout outs continually, as it was just clear in that second half that they were going to win. But let's put that a little bit more in the back burner, because as historic as it was for Detroit to break their 81 game losing streak, we talked about this in the pre-show. I don't know how much further that carries on into the future as far as a result that impacts the rest of the league at large. And so you mentioned Minnesota. We didn't even talk about their impressive 5-goal win at home over Madison, sweeping the season series against ostensibly what has been the second best team in the division, but is now currently seated in third after their loss, and Chicago's win over Indianapolis, moving them into second place in the Central Division. we'll get into a larger playoff picture later on as well in this episode. But I wanted to bring front and center the matchup between Atlanta and Carolina, because these are two super teams in the 2024 UFA season. Carolina came in as the only remaining undefeated team. Atlanta looking like one of the strongest teams given the quality of their wins and where they were coming from. They now have won 5 straight after beating the Flyers this past weekend, but both of their losses came against Carolina, and by a combined 11 goals. So it was no small feat for them to sort of reverse the narrative of what had been happening already in their very long established rivalry against the Flyers. But Hustle pitched one of their most impressive performances, I think, front to back of the season, if not the last couple of years. They only commit 13 turnovers. They force the Flyers to commit, I believe it was 23 turnovers, which was 4 more than their previous season high to this point. The Hustle defense was fantastic at limiting the top options for Carolina's offense. Anders Jungst and Alan Laviolette, who have almost been flawless through their first 5 starts of the season, combined for 6 throwaways against Atlanta's defense. And just all night long, it felt like the Hustle had leverage and an edge. They took an early lead, and it never really felt like they were going to give it up. The Flyers made some really impressive plays. They were, punchy at times, but it was always facing this uphill element of Hustle can get a calm down drive whenever they want. Their offense just kind of seems unperturbed almost at any juncture by defensive pressure. There are individual possessions where teams can make plays against them, but there's never really an aspect of the Hustle offense allowing multiple scores in a row, which has kind of been the defining feature, I feel like, elsewhere in this league, is defenses going on runs. And you guys experienced it in Chicago, right? A lot of short field turnovers that sort of led to the demise. That's just not happening with this Hustle team. And so I kind of wanted to get into a discussion about what were your thoughts about this particular matchup, and what do you think about both Carolina and Atlanta coming off of this game? Because I've had some pretty heated discussions with Evan Lepler around Carolina and Atlanta so far this season. I feel like Carolina to this point has kind of clearly been the best team given their previous 2 wins over Atlanta and given how they were undefeated coming into this matchup. But this 6-goal win for Atlanta kind of redefines things, especially given the momentum that they're showing right now.
Atlanta's the best team in the league. Hard stop. Like right now, they should be number 1 in your power rankings.
They're going to be. I'll give it to Evan Lepler. He was right about a week and a half ago when he called me out on it. But yeah, they are the best team in the league right now.
Yeah, and I think it was right to. I mean, you may have kind of felt like they were the best team in the league, and I think going into this game, I certainly had that feeling. But I think you still needed to see them prove it against Carolina to actually supplant them as the number 1 team in the power rankings. Because, like, how can I reasonably put a team with 2 losses ahead of Carolina, who is undefeated, especially when those 2 losses are to Carolina? They are the best team in the league right now, and I don't think there's much of a discussion for that, because it's not just how well their offense is playing. It's a complete team effort. Like in this game, their D-line converted 71% of their breaks. They had 13 blocks in the game against a team that has been probably the 2nd or 3rd best offense in the league behind Atlanta, and like maybe you make an argument for Salt Lake.
I would say Carolina's been better than Salt Lake to this point.
Yeah, and I was going to say, even if you threw Salt Lake in there, you'd have to do the pre-injury to Jordan Kerr Salt Lake, which I think we'll get to some Salt Lake stuff later in the pod. But here's the thing: Carolina won those games by 11 goals. I don't know that Carolina loses a game this season to anyone other than Atlanta. So even though this win was decisive, Atlanta actually needs another really decisive win against Carolina in their next matchup to actually secure the head-to-head advantage. They have to win by 6 goals to outright take it, and 5 just to like tie them in that head-to-head. and then there'll be some. So like that is something that I think could come into play. That being said, I think when both of these teams show up with their top 20, this is what I expect. Not necessarily for Atlanta to be 6 goals better, but I do think Atlanta is the more complete team with their top 20 out there. I think their offense is, slightly better. It's better at getting itself out of sticky situations. It's better at moving the disc in the handler space, in the middle space. And I think defensively, they force more blocks. As you can see in this game, they've had almost twice as many blocks as Carolina did. And their D-line converted at such a high percentage. Because that was the thing also in those first 2 games, is that Carolina's D-line was converting at something stupid like 80%.
They were 19 of 27 overall in their first 2 matchups against Atlanta.
And I think in one of those matchups, they were
11 of 13 in the season opener.
So like Atlanta's offense, which I said they were going to have 6 turns, I believe they had 9. So I was a little off. But still, against this Carolina team, having 9 total turnovers, not terrible at all. But their D-line converting 10 out of 14 break chances, while Carolina's only got 3 out of 10. So we saw when Atlanta has their full O-line there, they fight a little bit better getting that disc back and not allowing Carolina to convert. And even though this game was tied at halftime, or I think it was tied at halftime, or maybe a 1 goal one way or the other, it felt like Atlanta still was in control to me. Like, it felt like Atlanta still was the better team. It looked like Carolina was working so much harder offensively to convert, and it looked like Atlanta, sometimes they needed to get a dirty hold, or maybe they did get broken, but it didn't feel like it was as difficult. It didn't feel like they were struggling as much to like work the disc down the field. So despite the close score at halftime, I still felt like Atlanta is kind of in control, and they looked like the team that was going to be able to come out and have a better second half, whereas Carolina looked like they were kind of holding on for dear life just to get to halftime, and that's never a good place to be.
So I have a couple points in response. One, a moment ago, you talked about Atlanta needing at least 5 goals to tie the head-to-head tiebreaker with Carolina in their next matchup, which will be on the final regular season weekend of the season on July 20th. That will be a game of the week matchup. You're not going to want to miss that one. It will probably determine first or second seed in the South Division. But the complication is this Friday for the Flyers, where they have to go on the road and face an 8-2 DC team that currently sits in first place in the toughest division in the league in the East. And so you said that Carolina would probably win out against the rest of their slate, and I don't...
This is the one game.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but if Carolina drops that game, then Atlanta's worries become a lot more manageable. They don't have to win by 5 or 6. They've just got to win and win out the rest of their schedule, which should be pretty easy for Atlanta given the rest of their slate. They started off the season with maybe one of the hardest schedules in the year. I mean, their first 3 games were Flyers, New York, Flyers. They could have easily started 0-3, and instead they go 1-2, and now having won 5 in a row are sitting at 6-2 in complete control of their playoff destiny, essentially. The other point I wanted to make was about Atlanta's defense and just the overall discipline that this team is showing. The Hustle were without Justin Burnett, which I quietly, I think, omitted in our preview, given that the rest...
Yeah, I missed that as well.
I think it might have been a late scratch. I feel like that was not made apparent on the active rosters. I'd have to go back and look, but you can't really do that. But I feel like that's one we would have clearly earmarked as an important absence for this Hustle team. All defensive player last year, one of the best defensive matchups in the entire league. He was not available in this matchup. And yet the Hustle still produced 13 blocks. They're 10 of 14 on defensive break opportunities against a top 2 to 3 offense in the league. And they just did not allow the Flyers to get within any kind of attacking distance. Prior to this game, the Carolina offenses and in general the team's red zone chances. Here's the last 4 games: 18 against Houston, 15 against Austin, 22 against Dallas, 20 against Austin. They had 14 and 19 in their previous 2 matchups against Atlanta. Or excuse me, against Carolina. On this past Saturday against the Flyers, Atlanta limited Carolina to just 10 total red zone looks. The Flyers converted on 8 of them, but that is not a lot of easy scores for this Carolina team to digest. And to your point, when it was even close in this game, it felt like a pretty insurmountable edge for Atlanta.
And Lucas McClamrock,
balling out, man. Leads the team in blocks, 7th in the league overall, has 11 so far this season, and is just doing everything right for them defensively.
He had a really good game against us too. He's been kind of quietly doing this, right? Like I think a lot of his blocks that I see too, it's real, like they aren't the like full extension layout, like, you know, coming out of nowhere. It's not necessarily him going up and like skying somebody for the disc. It's him just seeing where the disc is going and straight up just out sprinting, like beating the guy he's guarding to the point of where the disc is going. And he's just doing that as well as anyone in the league right now. He was the real X factor in that game. I felt like we talked about Burnett maybe being that. Of course, he didn't play. McClamrock, man, he went out there and he balled out.
And Tyler Randall, their defense on Youngst and Laviolette on Carolina were the deciding factor in this game.
It's just another reason you should wear number 3.
Solid number.
Number 3s are like feasting in the league this year. This is great PR for all the number 3s out there. No, he's playing really well out there. Holzmeier, actually, by his standards, not a great game. Like, he had 3 throwaways, which he's been so good with the disc in his hands this year. I mean, he still contributes. Still Brett Holzmeier still, you know, takes up a lot of the oxygen on the field, but like him being under 400 total yards, having 3 throwaways, like had you just told me that before the game and told me nothing else about what happened, I would fear for how Atlanta fared in this game, because he's been even in their first loss down there where they played really poorly, he was kind of one of the bright spots in that game for that team, and he's been so good for them pretty much every time he takes the field. This I would say is his worst game
easily
of the season.
He doubled his throwaway total for the year in this single game.
Yeah. So but he still, you know, managed to like make an impact in the game, right? Like still had 3 goals, got a couple blocks, like he was still able to make some positive contributions, but this was the least Holzmeier-est game that he's had, right? Like it was everyone else. Like the whole team was playing so well, and that's where Atlanta, I think, has taken a step forward over maybe some of the past seasons, is that they can have a very like kind of pedestrian game from Holzmeier and still be dominant against a team that looked like they might have been the best team in the league. So this spells a lot of great things for Atlanta. Obviously, they do need to win out to have a chance at getting, most likely to have a chance at getting that 1 seed. But you know what? Even if they don't get the 1 seed, I think as long as they're suiting up in the playoffs with their top 20, like I feel like they can take this show on the road to Carolina if they need to. They're playing amazing right now. Like they're playing amazing in every facet of the game on both sides of the disc. And it's one of those, it kind of feels, even though there's no undefeated teams, right? You just talked about there's like, we're not going to finish with an undefeated team in the league this year, but they feel like some of those undefeated teams where when you really start looking closely to try to figure out where they're weak, you have to really take a microscope to them if you want to find something that's like a true weakness for them. Because I'm not really sure that they have one. They just have things that they have strengths, and then they have things that are still stronger than other teams. It's just not their strength because they have so many things that they do so well that something has to be less strong than something else.
The Hustle right now are second in offensive success rate, sixth in defensive success rate, and they lead the league in turnovers, or fewest turnovers per game, I should say, and in red zone efficiency, to give you a sense of how strong this Atlanta team is playing right now. And again, that's against competition like 3 games against Carolina, a game against New York, a game against Colorado. Like, they have not had an easy slate so far, and now their schedule gets just a little bit easier down the stretch. Their final set of games are at Houston, at Austin, hosting Dallas, and then again on the final weekend of the regular season, hosting Carolina for their 4th and final matchup of 2024. That feels like a pretty easy 3-1 finish for this Atlanta team at the very least.
Yeah, Austin's look largely non-competitive with the top teams in the South. So unless something changes there, I don't really fear for that game. And obviously Atlanta's in a completely different tier than Houston and Dallas are. So yeah, it looks like we're kind of just waiting for that last game of the season to see what happens in the final.
Well,
Carolina
no, you're
matchup.
skipping over this Week 10 matchup between Carolina and DC, which could be just as vital. And what's really
well, I just mean from Atlanta. I mean from an
I know,
Atlanta
man.
perspective and their schedule. I will say I know we'll be talking about that game. The Carolina DC game is intriguing. I do think Carolina, despite this recent result, still looks like the superior team. But as we've seen with several games this year, I think I'm going to wait to make a real prediction until I kind of see what rosters come out, because, you know, that does make a big impact on a lot of these regular season games. That we don't see that as much in the playoffs. Obviously, usually people are kind of all hands on deck at that point. But yeah, I still really like this Carolina team. Like we're gushing about Atlanta right now. Carolina is still an incredible team, and I think they just kind of ran into a buzzsaw right now. And you know, part of it, I do wonder if part of it is the fact that Atlanta is so battle tested and Carolina really isn't. Like, Carolina had their 2 games against Atlanta. In both games, Atlanta was missing significant pieces, and it was early in the season. Outside of the 3 times they've played Atlanta, Carolina hasn't really they haven't gone up against the New Yorks and the Colorados and like some of these like maybe more difficult matchups. So, you know, they always say you learn more from a loss than you do from a win. So we'll see if Carolina can learn some things from this game to make some improvements, you know, moving into this week, into the rest of the season.
Mentioned Atlanta's schedule a moment ago. Carolina's, they will finish out this season at DC this Friday, then at Pittsburgh on Saturday. So a pretty interesting interdivisional doubleheader for Carolina. And then on July 6th, they'll host Philadelphia, which again, just an interesting wrinkle at this point in the season for the Flyers to have 3 out-of-division opponents in a row. If they drop more than one of those, it could become really problematic really quickly for the Flyers in the South Division, and maybe falling back into a position that they were in last year where they don't get a home playoff game. I don't think that's what's going to happen, particularly against Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, given how the Flyers have looked so far in 2024. But Philly's at full monkey wrench mode at this point in the season, having been eliminated from the playoffs for the 2nd straight year. So they could punch up, and Pittsburgh is the most wild card team I think we've seen in this league for several seasons. And how about we transition into Detroit ending their 81-game losing streak against Pittsburgh, down 9 of their top 10 throwers. We talked about this a bit coming into this episode about there's plenty of flowers deserved for Detroit. They got off the schneid. It's been 7 years since we've experienced any kind of winning from this franchise. Terry Gaither, Jake Felton, big performances. They made all the big plays. They earned all the momentum. But kind of on the flip side of that is Pittsburgh. They won 4 of their last 5 games coming into this matchup. They had, as we mentioned in our preview pod last week, kind of the most control of their playoff destiny for the 3rd and final spot in the Central Division. Now they drop this game to Detroit. They're 4-4. They've got to face Carolina at home this coming weekend. And then they've got this end of season schedule, which is going to do them no favors. They are then on the road at Madison, host Indianapolis, which I'm sure you guys are going to be circling that one on your calendar as a get back game. And then they play at Philadelphia in the final weekend of the regular season in a matchup for the Commonwealth Cup of who gets to be the best team in the Keystone State. And again, that Phoenix team, despite just being 2-6, is going to be looking to end other teams' playoff hopes as their motivation in their back four games of the schedule. And so the Thunderbirds could be at 6-3 with a, or excuse me, they could be, they if they would have won if they would have won this past weekend, they would have been 5-3, but in control of their playoff destiny in the Central Division. Now they sit at 4-4. They're in fourth place, and they have a real chance at backsliding out of a potential playoff berth.
Yeah. Imagine sending your whole team to a club tournament just to finish last place in your pool and then also lose an AUDL game to a team who has
UFA game, Cam.
Yeah, UFA. Sorry. Most of their losing was in the AUDL, right?
So was most of your goal scoring, so be careful there.
It's fair. Pittsburgh, I don't know. I don't even know what to say about them. So the same way we lost to Chicago this weekend is the same way they beat Chicago a week ago, which was taking advantage of short field turnovers, because that's what happened to us. We had so many drops, especially in the early part of our possessions, to where, Chicago gets turnover and they're within 20 to 25 yards of the end zone. It's like they don't have to work very hard to get that break then, right? That's what Pittsburgh did to Chicago the week before. Chicago had all these, 2 or 3 throw possessions where they're turning the disc over before they get to midfield, and Pittsburgh just takes advantage of these short field break situations. And so they show that they can do things like that. They play out of their minds against us, which I think, honestly, partly was due to us being on the back day of a doubleheader, driving 6 hours, having some guys that didn't show up for us that game, and they took advantage of tired legs and some inexperience, I think, and they just took it to us. And then they have a game like they did this week where nobody shows up to the game. They lose to a Detroit team, and they might be looking back at their season at the end, one game out of the playoffs, and look at this week where they sent a skeleton crew to the game, and that's what cost them their playoff spot. So I don't know what to think of Pittsburgh. I don't know who they are. I don't know. I still feel like I don't know how good they are, because it feels like they can beat or lose to anybody.
How about we just run through a couple of stats from the last 3 games, perhaps? On June 2nd, against your Alley Cats, they, at that point, set a regular season low for fewest amount of turnovers in a single game. Atlanta has since set the new regular season low at 4 and tied New York's overall UFA record for fewest turnovers in a given game. But, again, we're within the same 20 days-ish of Pittsburgh establishing that record. They have just 5 turnovers against the Alley Cats on June 2nd. They're 22 of 22 within the red zone, 81% offensive success rate. In the past 2 games, they're 1-1, which is kind of bizarre given the stats I'm about to rattle off at you. 51 total turnovers for Pittsburgh, averaging 25.5 per game, again, after committing just 5 against the Alley Cats. And they are just 18 of 57 on offensive possessions. That's under 32% offensive success rate. I mean, just abysmal. Against Detroit, they were 8 of 14 within the red zone, which is 57%. I'd have to go scouring around a little bit, but that has to be top 3 worst red zone performance of the year for a given team. And to your point, there is no sense of what this T-Birds team is going to be like in their last set of games. Their last 4 games, I should say, of the 2024 calendar. I mean, Max Shepard played well.
Yeah.
He did not look like Max Shepard. They're going to have to, I think, integrate pieces in a way in the back half of this schedule that is going to be problematic given the kind of commitment that the rest of the Central Division playoff rosters have had to this point in the season. I think Chicago, Minnesota, and Madison have had more buy-in, and even Indy too. And so for the Thunderbirds to kind of continue to sort of shuffle roster pieces. One note of breaking news, New York traded, I don't know how official I can use this word, but they traded Tristan Yarder to Pittsburgh, and he will be active for this Saturday's game against Carolina. So that will be something to watch for the T-Birds. They are getting some help, but to your point, there's just no real sense of what to expect for Pittsburgh in the back half of their playoff push. And this might be the sort of Achilles heel that sort of disrupts their momentum and banishes them from the playoffs for a fourth straight year.
And there doesn't seem to be any real reason their offense should have been as bad as it was in that game against Detroit. Because that's the thing, right? Like, yeah, they were missing all these people, but they still had Max Shepard. They still had Carl Johnson, Pete Zaccardi, Jonathan Mass. Like, these are tenured O-line guys. Like, they're guys who have played a lot of UFA Ultimate. Like, there's no way they should have been that bad on offense. They converted just 12 out of 34 possessions on offense. And it did not look – this is not the same as their Chicago game. It did not look like conditions were really an issue in this Detroit like field. And I can tell you, like, I just played up in Chicago's new stadium. I've played 150 games in the UFA. You know, say all the jokes you want about playing indoors, whatever. 100 and, you know, all but like 20 of the games I've played have been outdoors. And that was the second windiest game I've ever played in for the UFA. Like, that, it's right on the lake. It is windy as all get out there. For us, it meant a lot of drops, actually, more than throwaways. The throwing was less the problem than the catching. So, like, all those turnovers they had in Chicago, I get it. Like, we actually just played a pretty similar game in terms of turnovers up there from both teams, where it's just, if you go up there, there's going to be a lot of turnovers because it's just insanely windy right there. It does not make sense, however, in this game for them to have 25 turnovers. Like, the conditions were not bad in Detroit. It looked very mild. And that's the part that's more concerning to me, is just how bad they were offensively, considering they had people there playing offense who have played enough Frisbee that this should not have been a problem. So that's where it like becomes weird for me. Like, how do you go from a team that only had 5 turnovers in the game to this? Like, I don't know. I don't know what to think. They are a complete wild card to me. Like, I feel like when we go play them on the second day of a back-to-back again, actually on the road again. We don't play them at home. And I'm just going to go into that game assuming we're going to get the 5 turnover version of them, because I think you need to go in assuming they're going to put their best foot forward. But like, it is incredible how there has been no more stark Jekyll and Hyde performances that I've seen, I think, from a team ever than what we've seen from Pittsburgh this year.
So Pittsburgh will host again Carolina, coming off of their matchup against DC this coming weekend. Detroit will finish out their schedule. They have 4 games remaining. They host Minnesota this coming weekend, and then they host Indy, and then they play at Minnesota and at Chicago to round out their season. I don't hold my breath for a second Detroit dub this year, but given the fact that, again, it's chaos season, anything is possible. I want to get off of the Pittsburgh-Detroit event and get back to a broader playoff picture. As we kind of mentioned coming into this episode, the East Division 3 teams have clinched their spots. There isn't a sense of what the seeding will be yet, but currently it is DC, Boston, and then New York in that order. DC holding a slight half game advantage given that they played at 10 games and currently sit at 8-2, while Boston is at 7-2, despite the Glory holding a head-to-head tiebreaker against DC. So it will be down to the wire in the East Division as to who gets to host a playoff home game and who has to go on the road. That figures to be very telltale as to who might advance to championship weekend again from the toughest division in the league. But I wanted to get to more kind of a wide open discussion of what we're seeing across the UFA. You know, in the Central, it feels like Minnesota has really taken a hold of that division at the top for a second straight year. They sit at 6-1. Every other team in the Central has at least 3 losses heading into week 10. I believe Minnesota just needs 2 more wins against a divisional opponent to essentially clinch that first round playoff spot and a first round playoff bye. But they do have an upcoming matchup at home against New York in the Super Series that we'll all be tuning in for in just a couple of weeks. Elsewhere, though, in the South, we've kind of discussed Carolina currently sitting on top at 6-1. Atlanta just a half game behind them, although needing a little bit of tiebreaker help to overcome them. Austin at 5-4 in the 3rd seed. Houston still alive at 4-5, but given their results against the top 3 teams in that division, looking less and less likely like they will continue to stay within the playoff race in that division. And then there's the West. The Wild Wild West, as Daniel Cohen and I referred to for a few years. Salt Lake at 7-1, but they just hold a half game advantage over the Seattle Cascades with still one more matchup remaining between those 2 teams that could decide first place within the West Division. And again, just how head spinning is it that the Cascades are going to be entering July with a chance at a first round playoff bye and hosting the West Division Championship game. At Memorial Stadium has always been a pretty significant home field advantage for the Scades. They've engineered some pretty impressive upsets over the years. I'm thinking against Dallas and Minnesota in some interdivisional matchups in years past. And so if they can somehow edge out the Salt Lake team that is kind of starting to quietly amass a slate of injuries. You mentioned earlier in this episode, Jordan Kerr dealing with the broken hand of his non-throwing hand. He has a pinky ring fracture, as far as I know. Pinky finger fracture, as far as I know. Will Selfridge still has not been on the field for several weeks. This Salt Lake offense has suddenly had to undergo a not so insignificant amount of changes. And as we've talked about many times on this show, that Shred offense operates a little bit like a Swiss watch. It is disciplined, it is finely tuned. And when you start messing with various timing mechanisms and how the whole works together, it really produces different results. And you could see that this last weekend against LA, where Salt Lake just had trouble getting any kind of edge against an Aviators team that isn't playing for anything at this point in the season, but just wants a quality win against a good opponent.
I'm going to use a slightly different analogy for Salt Lake. We've talked before about how like they've been able to switch kind of some pieces, I'll say, on the edge of the offense, like not the centerpieces, but they've been able to switch out some guys even mid-game and still be able to have the offense kind of running smoothly. But taking those pieces in and out kind of feels like switching the windshield wipers on your car. Like, not really something you're going to notice, not something that really affects the drive. When you take Jordan Kerr out of lineup, it feels like you tried to replace, say, like the engine that goes in a Hummer with the engine that belongs in a Volkswagen Beetle. It's just not going to get it done. It's not powerful enough. It's not made for that. Their offense is, and I was talking about this in the pre-show, there's nothing about like the system of their offense that seems like special or unique to me. Like there's nothing, like they don't do anything strategically on offense where I'm like, oh, like they do this one thing that other teams aren't doing, and like other teams need to kind of figure out how to implement that same style. The offense really is so run around what Jordan Kerr is able to do. And I'm not saying they literally go into practice and are like, all right, remember, we run everything through Jordan. It's not like that. It's just more the way he affects how the defense has to play. His speed, his height, his throwing ability is something that other teams can't really match up with. The only individual player I feel like, I should say players, we've ever seen really be able to take Jordan Kerr out of a game or at least limit him have been Cody Spicer and Antoine Davis, who are the last two defensive players of the year. So you're talking about needing that caliber of defender in order to kind of affect what he's able to do for this offense. Him being gone, that offense, they have struggled in this one game sample size, obviously, to like figure out how they have to adapt, because it seemed like everyone tried to play the same way they would if Jordan Kerr was in there, which is like, you can't do that. Like, you can't, because Jordan Kerr, especially when they get to the red zone, he can get any throw off he wants. He changes everything on the field when he gets the disc in the red zone, because every part of the field feels like it can be used by him with some sort of throw that he's going to be able to get off. And he's also so quick that he can also be the guy dishing off and then going and scoring the goal as well. Like, and he's incredibly hard to keep up with. He's probably one of the fastest players in this league. He's got great size. So other players are going to have to take on bigger roles. Like, they're going to have to do more. They're going to have to get involved more. And you mentioned Will Selfridge too. Like, I'm leaving him out too. He's not quite the engine of the offense, but he's a lot more important than some windshield wipers. Like, he unlocks another level to that offense when he's in there as well and makes them more explosive. So when you take out the guy who's like the engine of your offense, who's the focal point of like what you're able to do, and you take out a guy like Will Selfridge as well, who is maybe like the guy who punches up the offense the most. Like, Jordan Kerr is like your floor raiser. Like, if Jordan Kerr's on the field, you can only be so bad. And Will Selfridge is like the amplifier to everything that Jordan Kerr can do, and like raises the ceiling of that team.
That's what Selfridge has existed as. He just takes the top off and is able to push Salt Lake into their absolute optimum state on offense.
It's like, when those guys are there, it's so different. There are no substitutions for those two guys as far as I'm concerned, and especially Jordan Kerr. So I don't know what Salt Lake's plan is with like how long they're going to hold him out. They have 4 games left. They have 2 games against Portland. They have at New York and home against Seattle. But I am willing to say this right now. If Jordan Kerr does not play another game in the regular season and they just hold him out to the playoffs, which I think is possible, I'm going to call it now. Seattle takes the 1 seed.
Couple of points just to mention. Salt Lake did have their highest offensive success rate of the season this past weekend against LA. They converted on 65% of their overall offensive possessions. So kudos to them there. But just kind of anecdotally, it looked different. I don't know how else to say it than it just looked a little bit more reliant on making sure that they stayed within the rails, which is what they should be doing given that the kind of starters that they're lacking. But there was a noticeable lack of both explosiveness and I think an ability to get certain possessions that really mattered. I felt like down the stretch, it was their defense finally cracking the LA offense open and feasting on a couple of transition scores that actually led to Salt Lake widening their lead. It wasn't necessarily what I think we're used to seeing with the Shred offense, which is them just holding steady and able to sort of thwart off the opposing defense. And in addition to that, I think that you've got to kind of look at, like you were saying, what their upcoming matchups are. I mean, this isn't necessarily a super easy slate to close out the season. They have New York this coming Saturday on the road in a Super Series matchup and a rematch of last year's championship game. Kerr is currently listed as active, but as you mentioned, that could change as we approach game time, and he is just kind of at this wavering point of deciding whether they want to have him healthy later on or they really need to push for hosting the West Division Championship game and then just having to win one matchup in order to host championship weekend on August 23rd and 24th in Salt Lake City. So there's a lot of, I feel like, intangible decisions that Salt Lake has to make in their next couple of weeks that is really going to determine the wider playoff picture. And you mentioned the remaining matchup against Seattle. That will come on the final regular season weekend, July 19th at Salt Lake. The Shred have held a decisive advantage on the Cascades at home the past couple of years. They've basically run Seattle off the field. That will not be the case in 2024.
Mm-mm. Especially at this point in the season. I think if this game were early in the season, they could have caught them. But I feel like Seattle's rounded into such a good team. Like there's a lot of belief over there now too. So like they have the results to like kind of give them the confidence that they need, that they can go in there.
They had that confidence in their first game against San Diego where they just ran what turns out to be a pretty competitive Growler squad right off the field in Memorial Stadium. I mean,
they doubled them up
confidence,
in that first week, which was
confidence has been
crazy.
there so early for Seattle. And I think you're absolutely correct. Now that the results are catching up to that chutzpah, that hubris, they're one of the most dangerous teams, I feel like, heading into the final month of the regular season.
They haven't had quite as busy of a schedule recently, so I think it's been easy to kind of forget.
Nor have they really had like a good win over a quality team, but they're taking care of business whenever they need to, and they're blowing teams out in other games.
Yeah, and you mentioned the the offensive conversion percentage for Salt Lake against LA, which is all nice and good, right? But LA is one of the worst defenses in the league, so it's like, I mean, if you had a game where you had to start this experiment without Jordan Kerr, that was a good one to do against, because you're going against one of the, I think they're like 5th or 6th they're like 20th place, I think, in the league in offensive opponents' offensive line conversion. So like, that was a good one for them to kind of start off with. But, they're going to go up against a New York team. And, I know New York's had some roster issues recently, and who knows who's going to show up on the roster this week. But they still have a lot of very talented defenders over there in New York. And we saw what they were able to do to them last year with Jordan Kerr in the lineup. So I do think that that's going to be a really tough one for Salt Lake, going on the road to a New York team who has been really battle tested this year and has gone through a lot of adversity and has really, for the most part, come out on top. So I'm very interested to see what that matchup looks like. I'm assuming if Jordan Kerr didn't play in this game that he's probably not going to be playing again next week, but we'll see when the lineups come out if they were just holding him out of the LA game because it was LA. But it would feel weird to me that in a position where they still hadn't quite locked up a playoff spot, that they would hold him out of that game and then play him in this one, because that pinky is not going to be healed, obviously, by this week. So I don't know what his timetable is, but from the time he broke it until the playoffs start might be long enough for him to get that cast off. So they definitely need to be careful with maybe rushing him back too fast.
I've messaged with him just briefly, and he immediately started referencing casted Henke when Kyle Henke played with the cast on his offhand in 2021 for Dallas. And so that's where Kerr's mindset is. He is absolutely chomping at the bit to get back on the field. And I think, to your point, it was the right decision to leave him off of the active roster this past weekend against basically a meaningless opponent in LA at this point in the season. But I wonder how much they can afford managing his return too much, given the slate of opponents that they have, and given the sense of they do kind of need all of a sudden to clinch this first seed in the West that is turning out to be pretty punchy on the back end of its playoff competition. I mean, let's get into a little bit of discussion about the battle for number 3 in the West. Oakland sits at 5-2. They have a clear and decisive advantage over Colorado and San Diego. Growlers dropped both of their games at Colorado and at Oakland to basically sit on the verge of missing the postseason for the 3rd straight season. But Growlers have been uber competitive in basically every matchup that they've had this year, aside from that season opener at Seattle that they got blown out in. Colorado remains so talented that if they can simply take care of the matchups one game at a time in front of them, if somebody doesn't outright eliminate them and they linger into playoff contention into the final couple weeks, they would be an absolutely terror matchup, I think, for anyone in the West to face going into a playoff game. And then there's Oakland, who, again, just took care of business against the Growlers. San Diego playing their second game in as many days, but the Spiders get a 22-19 win in Week 9. The problem is that, once again, every single time Oakland felt like they were going to take a decisive and insurmountable lead, they kind of allowed the Growlers to backdoor into contention again and had the kind of seesaw effect that we're so used to seeing from the Spider squad. Again, there was no shortage of highlight plays. Raquan Atkins made his 2024 debut. The all rookie team member from last year was absolutely phenomenal for the Spiders on Saturday night. He scored, 5 goals and had over 400 yards? Seven goals. Seven goals, 408 yards receiving, and was just uncontainable, whether it was stretching the field in deep routes or getting open in red zone opportunities, the latter of which is a really interesting development for this team in general, because if they can add Adkins as another small space contributor to go along Frankenberg and some of the other options they have on offense, that could be really instrumental for them as they round into their potential playoff push. Oakland remains, I think, another just wild card team. Their highs are very high, but there is still so much inconsistency quarter to quarter that I don't know how to stack them up against quality competition. And I just wonder, given that they only lost by a single goal to Seattle, are they that much different? And are we just having a different sensation around the Cascades given their dominant victories? And that's just not how the Spiders go about their business. Everything feels like pretty skin of their teeth, pretty highlights and emotion dependent. But this Oakland team, for the second straight season, sits in control of their playoff destiny in the final month of the schedule. And if they can just sort of take care of business in their remaining games, they play at San Diego this coming Saturday, they play at LA this coming Sunday, and then they host Portland. They play at San Diego and they play at LA to finish out their schedule. Again, those 5 games, given how the Spiders finished their 2023 campaign, are by no means gimmies. What do you expect from Oakland and their ability to close out in 2024 and finally get back to the postseason for the first time in 7 years?
I think they're going to do it. And I think, I think they're going to go sweep their doubleheader this weekend and, sitting at 7 wins at that point. 8 wins will guarantee them a playoff spot. 7 wins more than likely gives them a playoff spot. I don't think it quite necessarily clinches, but there'd be a lot of things that would have to happen in a very particular way for it to not work out. I just think they're in such a good spot right now. This is very different than last year where, they needed to win 1 out of their final 2 games. Really, they have 5 games left and a couple against Portland. Raquan Atkins comes in. This is a guy who only averaged 2 goals a game in his 9 starts last year, and he comes, out of nowhere with a 7-goal performance in his first week, makes an immediate impact. The fact that they were able to get off to such a hot start, they went up 8-4 after the first quarter, right? So after the first quarter, they essentially, for the most part, just held serve, which was good enough to get the win. There's just a different feeling for me about this team than last year. I guess last year it kind of felt like every game they were in almost happened by accident. They just looked up in the fourth quarter. This is the best comparison I can have. We played a game, this is old man Cam with his 5,000 stories, but we went and had to play a game at Madison, final game of the season. We were already eliminated from the playoffs. This was Jared Payne's last year as the coach. It was the same weekend as Sandblast. We had some people who decided to go to Sandblast because
What
we were out of the playoffs.
presidential administration was this?
This would have been the
Yeah,
Obama
I thought
administration.
so. I thought we were going back
This
2
was like,
years.
well, no. This would have been like 2016. So yeah, it would have been the end of the Obama administration. We go up to Madison with 13 players, essentially, is what ends up happening. And we're not supposed. Madison was in their heyday at that point, and we look up at the start of the fourth quarter, and we're like, wait a second, we're only down by 1. Like, we're in this game, and that's kind of like the feeling I got from Oakland anytime they were going up against like a good opponent last year. They would just look up in the fourth quarter and be like, oh, hey, we could win this. Like, let's go do it. This year feels very different to me, and I don't know if it's just because after seeing them in so many close games and seeing them be able to kind of pull the rabbit out of the hat at the end, I just kind of now believe that like they're gonna be able to do it. But I feel like there's an increased level of confidence almost. Like they've won, they lost a lot of close games last year, and they won some close ones too. But it feels like all that heartbreak of like, especially the final week of the season where they lost 2 1-goal games. They've learned from that, and it does feel like throughout this year they've been kind of building. Because early on, the first couple games, it kind of looked like we're going to have the same ride with the Oakland Spires we did last year. But there just feels like something different. I think the moment for me was when they went up to Seattle and won that game. Like that game, I think was the switch point for me, where I started to view this Oakland Spiders team differently, and as a team that could really compete, not just to make the playoffs, but potentially compete to make it to championship weekend, because Seattle had been playing so well. They had already gone to Oakland and beaten Oakland, and Seattle played pretty well in a lot of spots in that game against Oakland in Seattle. And Oakland just, every time Seattle seemed to like come up with something where you felt like they were going to take control of the game, Oakland had a rebuttal almost immediately. And even though I think it still ended up being just a 1-goal victory, they kind of held that 1-goal lead and just kind of kept holding on to that lead for the majority of the second half. So I'm a believer in this Oakland team. I think they still have a shot as well as Seattle to even come away with first place in their division. Like, I could see them ending the season with just those 2 losses. I think they'll probably drop a game at some point, maybe to San Diego, but I'm a believer, man. I know it's still possible for some things to happen, but it's like, in my mind, it's already Salt Lake, Seattle, and Oakland, and I just don't quite know what order they're going to end up in.
Man, I want to agree with you. Colorado is just one of those teams that, unless they're eliminated, I'm going to continue to have some kind of belief in their ability to orchestrate in the back half of their schedule.
I get it's just not in their control is the problem.
Totally.
Like that's the problem, is like, right, Seattle just has to go win a game against, I think they have a game against Portland left on their schedule, and that locks them into the playoffs, right? Like,
the complication comes this Saturday because Colorado travels to play the Skades at Memorial Stadium, in what will essentially determine if Seattle can punch up into the number 1 seed in the West, or if Colorado just gets outright eliminated.
Yeah, and exactly. And I mean, we'll see what the lineups look like. I really like Seattle's chances hosting that game. And I think, they played Colorado really tough in their first game of the season, and it was in Colorado on the second day of a doubleheader. And that was Colorado's first game of the year, where we thought Colorado looked so good. And, all the hope that we had for Colorado, right? Just like 8 weeks ago, where we thought all these great things were going to happen. And I really believe in this Cascades team, and it's hard to say you believe in a Colorado team that has just not gotten the results this year. And in particular, they haven't really fared well without Jonathan Nethercutt, and he's only played in a couple of their away games so far. So I'll be interested to see if he's rostered for this one.
I'll check for you real quick to see what the active 20 is for right now. No Nethercutt, no Cochran, no Tabor, but they do have Quinn Finer, who looked real good for Colorado in his 2024 debut this past weekend, was definitely a big part of their 26-22 win over the Growlers.
Man, and that's the thing. That game actually, it swung at a point. San Diego was fighting back, and Miller, who had just a fantastic game, is almost like a commentator curse. They had just finished talking about the insane amount of yardage he had. They had a break opportunity right outside of the end zone, called a timeout to put the O-line on, and he just missed, like overshot Travis Dunn, I think it was, going to the front cone. That would have tied the game with about maybe like 3 or 4 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Instead, Colorado, goes on the other way. They get their dirty hold after the timeout to go up 2, and San Diego was just kind of out of it at that point. But that margin of victory was not as big as the game felt. It was so close there for a second. I don't know. They just, I'm trusting in Seattle, which is something, haven't been able to say about their UFA team in quite a while, but I'm trusting in Seattle. I think they're going to get the job done. I think they're going to get kind of that first, even though Colorado has had a rough year, I think you still kind of consider that like a marquee win. Like it would be their first win against Colorado since they entered the UFA. And I think that'll be a big one for them. And just continue to grow that confidence that, you mentioned they already have, and now they'll just have more results to back it up. I do want to quickly I know we got to be getting towards the end. We haven't talked about Madison, Minnesota, and I do think it deserves some of our time.
I just wanted to give a quick kind of epilogue to San Diego. I know they're not formally eliminated yet. They sit at 3-6 in 5th place currently in the West Division, but they've been such a team full of dogs this year for a San Diego squad that I don't think any of us expected really anything out of. They've pushed basically every single game that they've been a part of again since that opening weekend blowout in Seattle. To your point about Matt Miller, he currently leads the league in total yardage at almost 4,800 yards, even above Pavel Giannis. Pavel has played in one fewer game. But Travis Dunn is 3rd in total yards, leads the league in total scoring this year. And San Diego has just gotten production from basically every level of their roster. Their offense is obviously run through Dunn, Miller, and sort of the veteran leadership of that team. But Oliver Artis has had a fantastic year for them. Their defense has a lot of size and a I think underrated amount of playmaking. Casey Sugarman, Stefan Samu, Marshall Crawford have all been really good for them at times. And there's a discipline and commitment that I think extends and is very much an aspect of the coaching staff of Kevin Stewart and Kayla Helton, who have just been an absolute, I think, success backbone for this franchise for the past few seasons. And while they do stand to miss the playoffs for a 3rd straight season, I think that they're one of those teams that, even if they finished under 500, deserve a good bit of flowers for how they performed in 2024. But to your point, let's get to Minnesota Madison, because we have left that one off of the docket so far. Minnesota getting a much needed 22-17 win over Madison, who came into this matchup in 2nd place in the division and had the opportunity to possibly take over first. But Minnesota's defense just not allowing that to happen. They get 14 total blocks. They force the Radicals to commit 24 total turnovers. They hold the Radicals offense to just a 44% offensive success rate. And in general, just once again, kind of hold the momentum and sway in this matchup for the 4th straight season, which is a complete reversal of how this historic rivalry has gone. And I think it's a real, again, testament to the coaching staff of Ben Feldman, Max Longchamp, and everyone else involved with the Windchill organization of how they approach this Madison matchup and how dominant they've been, quite frankly, over the past couple of years.
Kudos to Minnesota. I mean, I figured Minnesota would win this game. They're great at home, first off, and they have been the class of the Central Division for the last 2 seasons. And I don't. There's no real argument against that. Like it's something they've worked towards for a long time, and they're there now, and they're trying to stay there as long as they can. They're doing a great job of it. They continue. They did struggle. We talked about this in the pre-show. It was really interesting. They didn't have Quinn Snyder. They didn't have Matt Rader, and the Huck game just never got. I mean, they were 2 for 11 on Hucks, and they are, when it comes to their Huck game, they're maybe the least consistent team in the league. Like, they will have games like this where they go 2 for 11, and then they'll have a game like last week where they were 13 for 17. So they are a team where you never quite know, if they're hitting their Hucks, you're probably in trouble, because when they're hitting there, they're pretty hard to stop. But obviously, having their 2 biggest deep receivers out of the lineup certainly is not going to help in that regard. But they were able to overcome that, and that's the thing, right? This Minnesota team has been won over the last couple of seasons, despite their issues last year with their offensive conversion rate and the amount of turnovers they would have. They find ways to win because they play such good defense. They're so good defensively, and then their O-line is pretty good. No, I wouldn't say they're necessarily at the elite levels of the league, but they're in the upper half. Right, they're pretty good about getting this back. They've got some guys who can go and get it back there. The real thing here, and we talked about this in our preview of the weekend, we said Kai Marcus cannot afford to have another 7 turnover game. You know what? He must have heard us, because he was like, I'm not going to have 7 turnovers this game. I'm going to have 11. I'm going to have, almost half of our team's turnovers. What you mentioned before we went live, about what do you do with Kai Marcus? Because he's this guy who unlocks this deep game for you. They completed 12 Hucks, but I talked about this also, where I said, Huck percentage can be really good. It can also be misleading. They were 60%, which isn't a terrible Huck percentage, but when you are throwing 20 of them, which they did, I actually think I used these exact same numbers.
You almost pegged this one.
It's I think I said 65%. You go 60%, that's not terrible, but when you throw 20, that means you had 8 turnovers just in the deep game, and Kai Marcus had 11 throwaways. You can't do that. That's something we would see with not necessarily from the numbers, but the feel of it. It feels very much like the Joe Cubit Detroit teams, where the team wasn't probably going to win the game, but if you were going to, you were going to just have to throw a lot of Hucks and complete a lot of easy, long throws with short possessions, because the offense wasn't going to be able to grind out 20 throw points. And that's almost what it feels like sometimes when Kai just decides to I'm just throwing it deep here. And it doesn't feel like they need to do that. They feel like a team that could work the disc up the field. Maybe they're not going to be the best in the league at it, but they're certainly capable. And they just aren't given the opportunity sometimes, because a couple throws into the possession, the disc is up, and then it's on the ground, and now you're playing defense.
So in 2 of their last 3 games, they've committed 24 or more turnovers. There was a 32 turnover incident at Detroit on June 8th, and granted, that was with a fair bit of weather. There is starting to become the concern of what the Radicals have experienced the past couple of years, which is just mistakes piling up. To your point, they commit 24 against Minnesota, which is just way too much against the reigning divisional champion. And you put the onus on Marcus, I think, or at least that's kind of how I'm reading your remarks. To me, and I've talked about this with a couple other of Madison alumni, this is a coaching mistake. Marcus is who he is. He's a chucker. He's going to test every single opportunity he has as a thrower, and he's going to stretch the field in every opportunity. But if he's committing 18 turnovers in 2 games, at some point, you've got to put a red light on him. At some point, you've got to discourage that through either a lineup adjustment, a role switch up, something to just allow that kind of raw throwaway total to affect you in 2 of the most important matchups of the year. And again, last week, they had kind of a going away win against Colorado at a certain point, but in the second half, turnovers started to mount up, and the Summit almost got a comeback win in Breeze Stevens Stadium. And we were talking about this too in the pregame. 18 turnovers in 2 games is such a remarkable kind of number, because you can look at a thrower like Andrew Roy, who has 19 total throwaways in 22 DC Breeze regular season starts over the past 2 years, and almost 1,000 total completions to offset that. It's just, as much as you might want to kind of look at the numbers and say Marcus needs to be better about his decision making, he's operating within a system that's encouraging him to throw an 85% completion rating and have an overall plus minus this season of -3, which is just not a number that can be sustainable for your main throwing option on offense.
Yeah, I agree. Coaching error for sure, but it's one thing as a player if you're like, yeah, I had 4 throwaways, but I completed 10 hucks. Like that, I could be like, okay, if he's not changing the coaching, say something. But when you have 7, when you have 11, like if you can't look in the mirror and be like, yeah, I need to do something differently, then like I don't know if a coach is going to help you. Like you got to be able to take some responsibility for that and be like, I need to be better. And for all I know, he is, but he's clearly not doing it in the middle of the game because he's not adjusting when things are not looking good.
Yeah, but
right?
I mean, this is the new Madison Radicals offense. They want to push tempo. They want to get in these fast break looks. They want to get Gabe Vordick and Anthony Gutowski and Jack Nelson running out into space and sort of dishing into the end zone to another trailing receiver. There isn't, I think, more of the possession-oriented drives that have been too conservative in the past couple of seasons for Madison. Like that's kind of almost completely gone away, particularly when they lack Pat Schreiwise in this particular matchup against Minnesota, and they lack some more of that veteran leadership that's just capable of simple possession drives. There's just an over-reliance on, well, Marcus is going to stretch the field for us, and that's what we need to open up our offense. And I think it's really interesting because on the flip side, you have this Minnesota team that suddenly has the best thrower in the division in Will Brandt, who in his first 3 starts this year is averaging 42 completions, over 5 assists, and 352 throwing yards, and is just an absolute problem within the red zone, shredding marks, can stretch the field with some of his throws, and is just kind of able to operate as a decision maker and passer in any space on the field, which sets up so well this Minnesota attack that, to your point a little bit earlier, lacked a hucking game in this matchup. They were just, what was it? Two of 11 on their deep shots. But when they have Brandt in the lineup, that doesn't matter because they can work within the red zone and go 18 of 19 within the 20 yards of a scoring opportunity, as they did against the Radicals.
Will Brandt's a cheat code, man. He just like he can break any mark from any sized person, and just he has just matured into such a good decision maker. I mean, I can't speak highly enough about Will Brandt. I think he's the best player on Minnesota. And that's saying something because I do hold a lot of those guys in high respect. Like, this isn't me saying like, he's the best player on a bad team. Like, he's the best player on a team that's got some dudes on it. And just the way he affects everything that you have to do defensively and everything you have to account for, it's really impressive, especially as young as he still is too. That's always the thing that's scary when it's someone in your division that's like, man, they're this good already, and he's like, what, 21 years old maybe? So like, it's not like he's going away anytime soon. Although, Minnesota is the feeder for the East Division, so maybe he'll take off to New York or DC or somewhere else. So I always forget that. Wait, when he graduates college, he probably takes a job out on the East Coast somewhere, and I won't have to worry about him anymore.
Dude, if Josh Clayton or Brandon Mattis is listening to this, you just put a stake through their heart. This is like Ralph Wiggum just like eating it against Lisa as we were taking her out to it.
I don't think people realize just how much talent has has migrated specifically from Minnesota to the East and a little bit of the South divisions. And it's just like, I made the joke that it makes sense. It's the DC Breeze. They are the Wind Chill. The Wind Chill clearly is like the minor league affiliate for the Breeze. Like it all lines up, right? It's just crazy how much, like, when you think about the amount of talent that is played for the Wind Chill and how it's all ended up somewhere else. Like if all those people like just stayed in Minnesota, we would be talking about them the same way we talked about New York, because I mean, heck, half those guys ended up in New York, right? Weinberg, Yacht, Osgar, just to name the three biggest names that have ended up over there, right? So, no, Minnesota's a great team. They continue to prove that they are the class of the Central Division, and they are in a very commanding lead in the division right now. They're essentially up 3 games on Madison right now because they now own the head-to-head tiebreaker. They're still up technically 3 games even on Chicago, though they do have 2 more games with Chicago, so that head-to-head could flip if Chicago is able to go beat Minnesota. But it's looking like the playoffs are going to run through Minnesota, and everyone else is just fighting to get in. We play Madison this weekend. We host Madison. Not indoors. We have home game of season outdoors. This is our outdoor home game. It's our last home game of the season, actually. We'll be obviously looking at the film from this game and seeing if we can take anything away from what Minnesota did, because they obviously had a lot of success against Madison's offense.
One more quick shout out for Minnesota's offense. Actually, 2 more because they're both rookies. Leo Sovel Fernandez and Gordon Larson. Larson being a college... Larson was a college teammate of Brandt's and just clearly has established chemistry. He's been a big-time gainer for the Wind Chill offense so far in his rookie season through his first 4 starts. And then Sovel Fernandez has been in every game so far for Minnesota this season. He's completing almost 96% of his throws, averages almost 2 scores a game, 24 completions, almost 300 total yards. And in his last 2 starts, doesn't have a mistake. And it's that kind of youthful production balance with the established vets of Josh Klain, Quinn Snyder, and Matt Rader, who weren't available in this game, but Colin Berry, Jordan Taylor. There's a real sort of synthesis happening right now for this Minnesota roster that I think could make them not only repeat as Central Division champions, but be almost favorites in that matchup against New York when the Empire come and visit in just a couple weeks at the beginning of July.
Yeah, I would favor them simply. Well, I mean, they're really good at home. They're really good. And I know they're going to, I think, be at TCO for that game, but like similar to Seafoam in the way that the wind works there. They're playing really well. If there's a weak point for them, it still is the offense at times, right? Like still a little few too many turnovers. You'd like to see them get those turnovers numbers down and be a little bit more consistent from game to game, because game to game, they aren't as consistent as you would love, but their ceiling offensively is, I still think, pretty high. So as long as they don't have one of like their low games, they're always going to be in it, because defensively they're gonna cause chaos. They're gonna get breaks. That's something they do consistently. So that'll be a fun one. Like that'll be, I don't even really have to root against them, because the chances of us catching them in the standings at this point are pretty much non-existent. So I can just kind of sit back and enjoy that one without a real rooting interest. But to your point about Sovel Fernandez, I know talking to Brandon Madison in the offseason, that seemed to be the guy he was like most excited about joining the team. And, I didn't know a lot about him. I just kind of learned everything through Brandon Mattis that I needed to know about him, I guess, to know why he was excited. And it's like the results are showing on the field that excitement was well warranted.
Yeah, and actually head coach Ben Feldman talked about in a pregame interview just a couple weeks ago about how they had been targeting Sovel Fernandez for a couple of years now, and they were just ecstatic to finally get him on the roster and committed this year. And clearly he's been a difference maker, just an absolute executor and finisher, I think, around the goal line, which is something that they've been very much in need of over the past couple of years. But I think that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass and the Week 9 recap. Again, there were 13 games, won by 12 home teams. We do have 3 teams clinched in the playoffs, all in the East Division with DC, Boston, and New York. But other than that, chaos season, as I love to espouse on this show, continues unabated going into the final 4 weeks of the 2024 UFA regular season. Cam and I will get you set up with a Week 10 preview pod in just a day or two, which will feature some really riveting matchups, as we already sort of briefly outlined in this episode. You've got Carolina at DC on Friday, and then you've got a rematch of the 2023 championship game with Salt Lake going to visit New York in Connecticut in a very interesting MLS stadium venue, which will be must-watch viewing. Again, you'll be able to watch that live and free on the UFA YouTube channel. We will be here to break down all of that action with you. Don't go too far. We'll talk to you soon now. Bye.
Every single game during a 12-game season can feel like a big game. We've been in the spotlight. We have the big game experience. We know what it takes in crunch time to get it done.
We are really battle-tested. This team knows how to win. We've proven that for the past 3 years.
Obviously, they're still very talented. They've got a lot of good pieces, and I like the trajectory that we're on.
Straight on three, 1, 2, 3.
Jordan Kerr flipping it into the end zone. A crescendo there. The New York championship train just keeps on rolling.